Several years ago, I was meeting with some Chinese communists, sorry about that. And we were having a discussion, and they were talking about how their government could be fast and efficient. And I said, that's horrible. I don't want a government that is fast and efficient. And sometimes you hear people talk about gridlock. In the U.S. Constitution, gridlock is a feature, not a bug.
Senator, although I should say tonight, Professor, could you come and tell us why we ought to celebrate the 250th birthday of this great country and why we should love the Constitution the way you surely do? Senator Ted Cruz.
Well, thank you very, very much. Let me first of all say congratulations. Wow. 100 million bucks? Listen, let me say to everyone here, congratulations. Congratulations on what y'all are doing here at the University of Austin. This matters. This is important. Look, higher education, I think, in America is broken. Higher education at far too many institutions across this country has lost its vision. And too many colleges and universities think their mission is to indoctrinate young people with one point of view and to make them terrified of any contrary facts, any contrary view, and in fact to raise little delicate sunflowers who cannot encounter opposition. I can think of few things more corrupting to education than that. And the University of Austin is designed to be a place to develop your mind, to challenge what you're thinking, to teach you, to learn from great thinkers throughout the ages, and then to put you in a position to be the next great thinker in the next age. That is profoundly needed. Now, I want to tell the young people also here, you can overcome any impediment. You can overcome any obstacle, and I'm going to point as an object lesson to this, Becca Schwinger. So Becca, who works here at the University of Austin, who's blushing because she knows exactly where this is going, Becca and I were in junior high together. I was in 8th grade. She was in 7th grade. Becca and I were in The Sound of Music together. I played Rolf, and she played Liesel. So, with me as a pimply-faced 13-year-old, on stage, I warbled out, "You are 16, going on 17." Now, I'm going to tell you right now, I cannot carry a tune. I believe in the entire song, I did not hit one note. And she sat there, gazing adoringly. It's acting. She's a very good actress. And then actually at the end of the scene, I'm embarrassed to say, I kissed her. And her husband, Scott, who's 6'4", has not slugged me once. But Becca endured my horrible singing for 3 performances, and she's gone on to have an incredible career and has overcome that adversity, so you could overcome anything. So a couple of months ago, 75 new students arrived here at the University of Austin. That doubled the number of students to 150. Now, what can 75 people do? What can 150 people do? 56 men signed the Declaration of Independence. 189 men are recorded as having been killed in the Alamo. It only takes a handful of courageous revolutionaries to change the world. You know, at the Alamo, I'm reminded of a story from years back in the 1980s. 1980s, Ronald Reagan was president. And Phil Graham was a Texas congressman. At the time, he was a conservative Democrat, at a time when conservative Democrats existed. And Phil Graham, as a conservative Democrat, was shepherding through Ronald Reagan's tax cut. And he was meeting with the fellow conservative Democrats from Texas and trying to convince other Democrats we ought to cut taxes. And Phil said, this is a moment like when William Barrett Travis drew a line in the sand in the Alamo. And he said to his fellow Texas congressmen, this is your choice to step across that line or not. And one of them said, Phil, everybody who stepped across that line, they died. And without missing a beat, Phil said, yes, they did. And everybody who didn't step across that line, they died too. But nobody remembers their names. What can 75 people do? What can 150 people do? Change the entire world. Now, 250 years ago, next July 4th, those 56 men signed the Declaration of Independence. When they signed it, they pledged their lives, fortunes, and sacred honors. Now, understand, this was a different act than posting something on Instagram. This was committing treason. They were declaring to the monarch, the King of England, we are in open rebellion. And those words, we pledge our lives, fortune, and sacred honor, those weren't empty words. With an act of treason, they were quite literally putting their own lives and their families' lives and everything they had worked for at risk. A couple of months ago, we had a hearing in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And we were considering the nomination of several appointees to the State Department, one of whom in his written testimony had written that our rights do not come from government, they come from God. And I will say one of my colleagues, Tim Kaine, Democrat from Virginia, when it was his time to question, he challenged the nominee on that statement. He said, you said in your testimony, our rights don't come from government, they come from God. He said, that is a radical statement. That is an extreme statement. That is a dangerous statement. He said, that's the kind of theocratic extremism that nations like Iran are based on, not America. We don't believe that here. Now, I was literally walking into the hearing as Tim was saying this. I almost fell over. And I got a chance to question shortly thereafter, and I had a whole series of questions I was planning to ask, but I changed what I was going to say. And I said, look, Tim Kaine just made the statement that the idea that our rights come from God and not from government is radical and extreme and dangerous. And I said, in a sense, he's right. But it is also literally the founding principle upon which the United States of America was created. And I said at the hearing, if you don't believe me, maybe you will believe another Virginian, Thomas Jefferson, who in the Declaration penned these words, we hold these truths to be self-evident. Now stop, self-evident, so obvious that any imbecile could figure it out. That all men are created equal. And that they are endowed by their Creator. Not by government, not by the DNC or the RNC, but by God Almighty, with certain unalienable rights that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That was extraordinary and revolutionary. That was in 1776. Fast forward to 1787. And after difficult years, failed years under the Articles of Confederation, the Constitution was drafted. The Constitution, likewise, was a radical document. It was a radical document because it built on what the Declaration has said. What does it mean that our rights come from God? For most of history, people had believed that monarchs, kings and queens and emperors get their power from God, and that sovereignty flows down from the monarch, from God to the monarch, and then the monarch governs the people. And under that view of things, rights are things to be given like crumbs from the table of the monarch. But if government is giving you your rights, it means government can take your rights. And it also means the only source of legitimacy for any right you might claim to have is whatever the current law might be. When I was in that Senate Foreign Relations Committee hearing, I pointed out, I said, look, under that line of thinking, for the first 100 years of our nation's history, 100 plus, when slavery was legal, under that reasoning, there was nothing wrong with it. Because if rights don't come from God, under the law, slavery was legal, so clearly it must be okay. Except it wasn't. Slavery is wrong and grotesque and evil and immoral, and it was wrong when the law allowed it, and it's wrong when we banned it, and we fought a bloody civil war to end it. And the reason it is wrong is because our rights come from God Almighty, and the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is not something government has the power to take away. The Constitution inverted the model of sovereignty. And instead of viewing sovereignty as something that originates from God, goes down to the monarch and the government, and then goes to the people, instead, it turns it upside down, and it begins with the opening words of the Constitution, we the people. It is the people who come together to form a government and to lend that government authority. The sovereignty remains with the people. And authority is lent for a period of time. But the purpose of the Constitution, Thomas Jefferson referred to the Constitution as chains to bind the mischief of government. You look at the Constitution that came together. I believe it is the greatest document authored by mortal hands in the history of mankind. The Constitution inverted sovereignty, and it did something the Supreme Court has referred to as splitting the atom of sovereignty. Now understand, the framers, we were extraordinarily blessed to have framers like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, and Benjamin Franklin, and John Adams, and Alexander Hamilton. These were men of extraordinary erudition. I'm reminded of when President JFK hosted a dinner at the White House with a table full of Nobel laureates, brilliant thinkers. And he commented, this is the greatest assemblage of minds in this building since Thomas Jefferson dined alone. But America, I believe, was truly blessed by God. It was providential, the leaders that came together to sign the Declaration, came together to write the Constitution. These were leaders of extraordinary wisdom and judgment who had to make balances, who had to make trade-offs. They were not naive, they were not foolish. They understood that man is a fallen creature. They understood that people behave according to rational incentives. Look, I think many of the most pernicious political ideas foisted upon humanity have come from this notion that humans are perfectible. You look at the very heart of socialism or communism, from each according to his abilities to each according to his needs. I think the framers understood human beings will behave according to their self-interest, so let's not deny it. Let's not pretend that doesn't exist. Instead, let's create systems to contain it. So splitting the atoms of sovereignty, what does that mean? They divided federal power vertically and horizontally. Vertically, they divided it with federalism between the federal government, the states, and the local governments. And they were designed to fight each other. Horizontally, they divided federal power between the legislative, the executive, and the judiciary. And they were designed to fight each other. Several years ago, I was meeting with some Chinese communists, sorry about that. And we were having a discussion, and they were talking about how their government could be fast and efficient. And I said, that's horrible. I don't want a government that is fast and efficient. And sometimes you hear people talk about gridlock. In the U.S. Constitution, gridlock is a feature, not a bug. After the Constitution was written, there were 2 years where the nation debated, do we adopt this document? A series of newspaper editorials were written that became called the Federalist Papers. Written in New York, written under a pseudonym of Publius. James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay wrote them. I got to say, you read even one of the Federalist Papers, then you look at your local newspaper and read it, and think somehow, boy, the editorials have gone down in quality. Although I will say this, since I admitted at the outset that I played Rolf alongside Becca, I am certain the Austin American Statesman has already reported that Cruz admitted he was a Nazi. But the Federalist Papers were an extraordinary argument why we should adopt the Constitution. In Federalist 10, Madison writes about what he calls factions. Today we'd probably call those special interests. And it accepted the notion everyone is going to behave according to their self-interest. He wasn't horrified by it. He'd read Genesis. But he said the best way to contain it is ambition must counteract ambition. And so the federal government is designed so that no one faction, no one special interest can seize control of the entirety of government. Because if any one faction can seize control of the entirety of government, they will use it to advance their own ends at the expense of everyone else. And the genius of saying, let's create different parts that are selected in different ways, that are institutionally designed to be oppositional. If we have a bunch of folks in Washington fighting each other, then at least they can't gang up together and fight all of us. That was the entire design. Now, the Constitution obviously was adopted 2 years later, 1789. And in the course of the debate over the Constitution, there was a vigorous debate about whether or not we need a Bill of Rights. The Federalists, the advocates for the Constitution, they argued we don't need a Bill of Rights. And the reason they said we don't need a Bill of Rights is they said this is not a government of general jurisdiction. And actually think of it in contradiction to the states. So the states are governments of general jurisdiction. The states have authority under the law to do anything unless it is prohibited to the states to do. Instead, the framers, one of the essential elements of the Constitution is the federal government was not a government of general jurisdiction. Rather, the federal government is a government of enumerated powers. Article 1, Section 8 specifies 18 powers given to Congress and the federal government. And the framers argued if it's not in the enumerated powers, then the federal government doesn't have the power to do it. Well, the Anti-Federalists came back with vigorous arguments. We need a Bill of Rights. Government power always tends to expand. And they had an argument. Actually, my senior thesis in college went through the debates over the 9th and 10th Amendments to the Constitution. And one of the things I did is I analyzed the debate between the Federalists and Anti-Federalists over whether we need a Bill of Rights. And my conclusion was the Anti-Federalists won. One of the arguments they made is, look, even if it remains a government of enumerated powers, the federal government could still violate our fundamental rights in the exercise of those enumerated powers. So, for example, one of the enumerated powers is to create a post office. The federal government has created a post office. If the post office suddenly decided we're only going to deliver communications, and by the way, for young people, there was a time when a post office was it. There wasn't no email, there wasn't no texting. It was write a letter or sing out your window. And if a post office suddenly says we'll only deliver letters from Republicans, or we'll only deliver letters from Democrats, or only deliver letters from Southern Baptists, that would clearly violate our rights, and yet there was nothing in the Constitution without a Bill of Rights that prohibited it. Well, the Federalists won the big argument, and the Constitution was adopted, but the Anti-Federalists won the sub-argument, and it was adopted under the understanding that we would adopt the Bill of Rights. And the first 10 amendments to the Constitution were that Bill of Rights. James Madison was the principal author of the Bill of Rights. The first two protections in the First Amendment to the Constitution, the number one protection, what they led off, the first clause of the First Amendment of the Bill of Rights is protecting religious liberty. Look, we were a nation that was founded by people fleeing religious oppression, coming from other countries where the government asserted the power to control what you believed and how you worshiped. And the framers believed the very first liberty any one of us has is to worship the Lord God Almighty with all of our hearts, minds, and souls. And that ultimately it is each of us in our conscience who makes the decision what that means and how to worship or whether not to worship at all. That it is not government's business to take away that liberty. That is the first liberty ensconced and protected in the Bill of Rights, and right behind that is free speech. Free speech, again, is a radical concept. You want to understand how radical? Just take a look at Europe. Take a look at Europe, where many of the nations there do not have a tradition of free speech, do not have a fundamental protection of free speech. We're seeing in the United Kingdom right now people being arrested for sending tweets the government doesn't like. And by the way, free speech, sometimes I listen to my colleagues and they will say, well, the First Amendment doesn't protect hate speech. It doesn't protect hateful speech. It doesn't protect bad speech. And that is utter and complete nonsense. Look, you don't need a First Amendment to protect popular speech. If you say something everyone agrees with, you don't need any legal protection at all. The only purpose of the First Amendment when it comes to free speech is to protect unpopular speech, is to protect speech the majority disagrees with. And by the way, what that speech is at any given time can change. But the First Amendment protects hateful speech, it protects idiotic speech, it protects bigoted speech. The First Amendment protects Nazis and Klansmen. There we go. I've given the headline to the Statesman now. Now, to be clear, the fact that you have a legal right to spout garbage does not mean that everyone else has their moral obligation lifted to confront your garbage with truth. I think Nazis and Klansmen are ignorant, bigoted morons. I think their ideas are imbecilic and dangerous. But I agree with John Stuart Mill, who said the best cure for bad speech is more speech. That rather than have the government decide, we don't like some ideas, so you don't get to say them, instead, the marketplace of ideas counters that. And that brings us right back to the University of Austin. Look, to the students here, your job as a student is not to go in and listen to your professors and agree with everything your professors teach. It is to come in and think and challenge and have an open mind to learn, but also confront yourself. Confront your own beliefs. Read things you disagree with. I went to law school at Harvard. When I was there were more communists on the faculty than there were Republicans. That's not hyperbole. There were about a dozen self-described Marxists. This is not me calling them communists. They would tell you I'm a Marxist. It's written in their bio half the time. When I was there was one open Republican on the entire faculty. Now, I went out of my way to take classes from the communists. And let me be clear, I am the son of a Cuban immigrant. My family has been imprisoned and tortured. I hate communists. But I wanted to know what they were teaching to understand it, because you can't fight something if you don't know what it is, if you don't understand it. And so I want to say, look, I am excited. All right, I hope you take some like grainy black and white pictures of your students and your faculty. Because I'm thinking of like superhero movies where you see the old grainy black and white photos of the very first gathering of the Avengers. And I'm just looking forward with excitement to where everyone is going to be in 5 years and 10 years and 20 years and 30 years and 50 years. Because Texas needs the University of Austin and America needs the University of Austin. And so I'll close the way I opened by saying congratulations. What y'all are doing here is important.
Hi, Senator. Thank you so much for your time today. I actually wanted to ask, will you be running for president in the future? Because I really resonated with what you said about how politicians should be serving the people. And I really wanted to ask your thoughts on how all presidential candidates should be here to serve the people.
Well, I'll send you the check later. So, look, thank you for that question. I will say I'm not prepared to make an announcement tonight. But listen, in 2016, I did run for president. Many of y'all were in grade school then. But I will tell you, it was the most fun I've ever had in my life. I loved every minute of every hour of every day. It was a wild roller coaster. You get punched in the face as you wake up in the morning.
I'm sorry.
But I'll tell you, I leapt out of bed every day. Because listen, I believe in what I'm fighting for. I believe in the principles of freedom. I believe in the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. I think the American free enterprise system is the greatest system for the advancement of prosperity and opportunity the world has ever created. And so I'll tell you, what I am committed to doing is fighting for this country, fighting for free enterprise, fighting for the Constitution, and fighting for our future. And I think right now, look, I work very closely with President Trump. I think we're accomplishing extraordinary things. There may be people here who support President Trump, people here who disagree with President Trump. But I think it matters enormously that we continue defending the great and eternal principles upon which this country was founded. And what I can promise you is this, that as long as there's breath in my body, I'm going to keep fighting to defend those principles.
Thank you so much, Senator.
Hello, Professor Cruz. My name is Patrick. Thank you, first of all, for coming here today. Your speech was absolutely fantastic. I'm afraid I have sort of a tricky question. Here at the University of Austin, we have established a constitution for a school, and I wanted to ask you how you think a constitution for a country and a constitution for a place of education should differ.
Well, that's an interesting question. I will confess it's not one that I have thought an enormous amount about. But I will say there are differences. So let's take it in the aftermath, say, of the tragic murder of Charlie Kirk. So Charlie was someone I knew very well. Patrick, how old are you?
I am 20.
You're 20. I met Charlie when he was 18 years old. He was a kid who had just graduated from high school up in Chicago. And he had a vision. And I remember sitting down in the living room of a friend of mine and listening to Charlie's vision of trying to energize and excite and motivate young people across America, to get young people passionate about defending liberty, about defending free enterprise, about defending the Constitution. And this was late 2012, early 2013. So Barack Obama had just been reelected. It was not a time where the idea that young people would be conservatives and that would be cool, that did not seem a terribly intuitive notion at the time. And I think what Charlie built in Turning Point was incredibly important. As everyone knows, he was tragically murdered, and he was murdered because of what he said, because his ideas were frightening politically to someone who disagreed with him. Now, I will say in the aftermath of that, we saw far too many instances of people reveling in hate, celebrating Charlie Kirk's murder. And it was heartbreaking. And let's be clear, by the way, in my view, political violence is always, always, always wrong. And that is true whether I agree or disagree with someone. You are never justified in taking to violence to silence a voice you disagree with. But we saw university professors, we saw high school and elementary school teachers celebrating the murder of Charlie Kirk, celebrating it, and in times being hateful and harassing other students. And I will say, your question about how a constitution of a university and a country would differ. You have, under the First Amendment, the right to say the most hateful thing you want, even celebrating the murder of someone you disagree with. That is protected legally, and it means you cannot be criminally prosecuted for doing so. The First Amendment does not mean you are immune from consequence from what you say. It means the government can't come after you for it. So an example I use, if you think free speech means you can say anything with no consequence, any of you that have a job, go into your boss tomorrow and curse him out. You will very quickly discover that speech can have consequence when you're unemployed. I think, so for example, the president of the Oxford Union, who actually had debated Charlie Kirk, and he is this bilious leftist who showed up to the debate, it looked like in his pajamas because he had no respect for the Oxford Union or for anyone attending it. He had debated Charlie Kirk and disagreed with him, and when Charlie was murdered, he openly celebrated it online. In my view, I think Oxford should have expelled that student for the same reason that if you have a student who dresses as a Klansman and goes and burns a cross outside of the dorm of an African-American student. Now again, under the First Amendment, you can't be prosecuted for that. But a school doesn't have any obligation to tolerate that kind of harassment and hate. And so I do think there are distinctions. That being said, I think it is incredibly important for a school to allow a wide range of genuine academic disagreement and wide views. So that's one area that I would draw a distinction between what government can do and what a private institution can do.
Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much for your speech. Thank you for being here. I want to give a short analogy first. So
when Donald Trump became, or when was running for president in 2016, I remember during, I believe, near his inaugural speech around that time, he said that it was very difficult for him to find good people. And as we see later, a lot of those people were later because they just didn't serve America as well as he anticipated.
Yeah.
So how do we, as people, for building our teams, whether it be business or politics, how do we find the right people, especially before they have that role, because they might change?
Look, that's a great question. And I will tell you, in terms of life skills, the ability to be a judge of talent and character is one of the most important life skills you will ever learn. And it's not algebra, it's not world history, it's learning to measure and judge people. I'm reminded, Warren Buffett said once, he said when he's hiring people, he wants them to be brilliant, indefatigable, and loyal. And he said, if I can't have the third, I want them lazy and stupid. That is a very important judgment. I can tell you, I think in the first term, I think President Trump made some poor decisions in terms of the team that he put together, and I think a number of the people appointed in the first term actively worked against the president and the agenda he was trying to accomplish. I think in the second term, he's done a much better job. He's much more aware, and his inner team are more aware of that risk, and they're looking for people to appoint who will faithfully execute the agenda that the president ran on and that the people elected him for. So I think making a judgment, look, when I'm hiring people, I try to engage them. I try to look at their record. I try to get to know them and I have a whole series of questions that I will ask people, and a lot of times it's questions about what motivates them, where they come from, what are your passions, when you wake up in the morning, what do you care about? You try to get an assessment of a value set of a person. And then I think it's important also, look, you want to choose well to begin with a team, but when you assemble a team also, you want to inculcate loyalty. I joke, at this point I've been in the Senate 13 years. I've got a lot of people who've come to work for me and they've gone on to do other things, and they go with my blessings. I actively and aggressively push the alums from my office to go do. I've got alums that have been members of Congress, that have been judges, that have done all sorts of things. But every one of them, when they sit down on the way out, I have kind of the same talk I have with them, which is, listen, our office, we're a family. And we're a little bit of a cult. It's like the mafia. It's blood in, blood out. And it's also like Hotel California. You can check out anytime you like, but you can never leave. And I do think working to build that loyalty. And part of the way you build that loyalty also is making sure you don't have a culture where people are going at each other. Look, a lot of places in politics, a lot of places in business, you have people that advance and excel by stabbing each other in the back. The way you climb the ladder is you take out your opposition. And I think that's a toxic way to run a team. And so I think anyone who's leading a team, part of what you do is make sure you have a culture where it doesn't help you to stab the guy behind you in the back. And if anything, it hurts you. And if you can build a team where everyone trusts each other, and part of that also, and this is kind of a long answer to the question, part of that also is having a goal bigger than yourself. So one of the reasons that I love the teams that have come together that I've had the chance to work with is they're not working for me. This is not about Ted. It's not about one person. It is about principles and values that are larger than ourselves. And so they're working for the same things I am. And if you have a common goal that motivates everyone, in my experience, that is really powerful, unifying a team and making the bonds between the members much stronger. So hope that helps.
Thank you.
Thank you for your outstanding service to the people of Texas. My question tonight is, what are the steps to running for office? Is going to law school an important first step? Or would you say getting involved with an interest group in Washington, D.C. is a good step? As someone who wants to run for office someday, maybe as a senator of Texas, what are the steps?
I hope you're not announcing you're primarying me.
I am.
Well, I started with saying thank God for the Constitution, and the Constitution specifies senators have to be 30, so I think I'm a little bit safe right now.
Yes, what are the steps, and how can we further support you if you choose to run for president?
Well, thank you. Look, in terms, all right, let's take, there were lots of kind of steps in your question. You started with, should you go to law school if you want to run for office? And I would say it depends. If the only reason to go to law school is to run for office, don't go to law school. In my experience, there were a lot of people in law school who hated it and were miserable with it. I loved law school, but my suggestion is you should go to law school if you want to be a lawyer. And you should take the time. Look, and I'll say this more broadly to everyone. One of the most important things you can do as a young person, you can do as a college student or a high school student or someone in your 20s, is engage in introspection. Figure out what your passions are. Think about, you have the time right now to read great books, to think, to study. Think about what excites you, what gets your blood flowing. When you wake up in the morning, what's the very first thing you think about? When you go to bed at night, what's the last thing you're thinking about as you fade off to sleep? And the advice that I give young people consistently is whatever your passion is, do that. Devote your life to your passion. You'll be better at it. You will excel if you love what you're doing. And you'll be happier. Now, when I was in college, I took every class that had anything resembling the word law in it. I read books about law, and I wanted to be a lawyer. I found this interesting. I liked it. I mentioned I wrote my thesis on the 9th and 10th Amendments to the Constitution. So by the time I went to law school, I knew I wanted to do this. I'd thought about it and liked it. If you want to be a lawyer, go to law school, definitely. If you want to run for office, what I would say is find an issue you care about and go and build a record. Go and do something that matters. So when I came out of law school. I had a couple of clerkships that were incredible experiences. And I knew I wanted to run. I've known I wanted to run since I was a little kid. And I thought about it, and I thought about it in terms of, I thought about like a three-stranded rope. That to run for office, I needed three things. One, I needed skills and a record. Two, I needed money. And three, I needed relationships. And mind you, I come from a family, no one had ever been in office. We were not politically connected. But I was looking at it and saying, okay, what do you need? And all three of those I viewed as intertwined, and you needed all three of them. Now, I have to admit, my initial plan when I was your age is I was going to go make $1 gazillion and make the money first and then turn around in my 40s and run once I had the money to set it up. I ended up pursuing different options where I spent more time on skills and a record early on and relationships. So I actually, coming out of college and law school, I had about $100,000 in student loans. That free tuition thing sounds awesome. I joked at the time I had a mortgage, but I didn't have a house. And I paid off my student loans for nearly 20 years. I was 38 years old when I made the last payment on my student loans. So the money side was this like wrinkly little thread, but skills and relationships were a lot more robust. What I would say in terms of running for office, has anyone noticed that politicians tell us one thing and do something different? In my view, the best way to run for office is to have a record, to have been in the fight, so that everyone knows exactly what you're going to do. When I first ran for office, I put up a web page, and I pointed out, I said, look, everyone on their web page has a policy page. And if you look at Republican candidates for almost any office in Texas and you print out their issues pages, they're all almost word for word identical. All right, if you're running as a Republican in Texas, you say the words, I support the Second Amendment. Unless you're a moron, that is the right answer in a Republican primary in the state of Texas, to say, I support the Second Amendment. I pointed out when I was first running for office, I said, look, if you go to our webpage, I don't have an issues page. I actually don't say I support the Second Amendment. I don't say a word about what is hidden in the deep recesses of my heart. What I do say is every politician stands before us and says they believe certain things. Show me. When have you fought for them? When have you bled for them? And what have you accomplished? And what my webpage then said, and it was called A Proven Record, was Ted has spent the past decade fighting and winning conservative victories. So in the Second Amendment, I don't say I support the Second Amendment, but this is now 15 years ago, I said Ted led a coalition of 31 states defending the Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms before the U.S. Supreme Court and won a landmark case upholding the individual right to keep and bear arms. So what I would say, when you're running for office, it's much better to show rather than say, and the best way to show is have a record where you've been fighting for something. So that's what I would encourage you to do, is fight for something you care about, build a record, and then be in a position that you can run and you can point to something and say, that's what I'll do if I get elected.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you for joining us this evening, Senator Cruz. I have a bit of a lighter-hearted question. As we're looking ahead to winter break, me and some of my friends have been planning a vacation overseas. The two places we've narrowed our destination down to are Tel Aviv and Cancun. And I was curious, which of these two places you would recommend?
So they're both awesome. I will confess, I think I'm probably the most effective travel agent in the world for Cancun. I heartily recommend it, particularly if it's really damn cold outside. It's warm in Cancun. And Tel Aviv is fantastic. I have been many times to Tel Aviv and Israel, and so that is spectacular. And so, combine them both and do both. I don't know that there are any direct flights, though.
That'd be hard, but thank you.
Thank you so much for your time, Senator Cruz. Both your support of UATX and the fact that you're a politician seem to make explicit that you believe some pretty comprehensive changes need to be made to America. How comprehensive do you believe that these should be? And in a practical sense, how do you think they should be executed? Are a lot of kind of startup style movements like UATX a good idea?
Fabulous question. Look, in many ways, the changes I think that should be made are restorations of the principles upon which the country was built that I think we have gotten away from. I will tell you, one of the things I've done in my time in the Senate is that I've written 4 books, and I've enjoyed writing books. The last book I wrote was entitled Unwoke: How to Defeat Cultural Marxism in America. And so what the book does is it traces how the radical left has seized control of major institutions in America. And it actually starts with, chapter 1 is colleges and universities, which I call the Wuhan lab of the woke virus. It is where the woke virus was created, it's where it mutated, and it's where it spread to the world. And it traced, so each chapter of the book, I have one on colleges and universities, one on K through 12, one on journalism, big business, big tech, entertainment, sports, science, talking about how cultural Marxism took over every one of those institutions. In each chapter, I lay out a strategy to take them back. And one of the strategies is explicitly what y'all are doing right here, which is either create new institutions to challenge the corrupted institutions that have been taken over, or fight to take the old institutions back. And one of the most effective ways to fight is to go after the money. And so what y'all are doing, so for example, in the chapter on big tech, I talked about Elon Musk's purchase of Twitter, which I think is the single most important step for free speech in our lifetimes. And it changed the entire terrain. It may well have changed the outcome of the last election, because people could speak freely, because you couldn't censor and silence people, and so you had a marketplace of ideas. And what's interesting is Elon's buying Twitter changed Facebook. It changed Google. It changed the other players in tech in the same way we just saw David Ellison buy Paramount Pictures and CBS, and that resulted in Barry Weiss's taking over CBS News. By the way, for a 2-year-old college, one of your leaders is running CBS News. I mean, that's pretty stout. But it's the same idea. That's one avenue. but creating competition or taking them back matters enormously. So what I will say is what y'all are doing at University of Austin will matter for everyone here, but it also is going to matter in terms of the competition and pressure that it's going to put on UT Austin, on A&M, on Rice, on Baylor, on University of Chicago, on Harvard and Yale, all across the country. You're going to be competing and changing. So I think this is a huge part of how you take institutions back.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you for your time and for your words, Senator Cruz. My question to you is, although it's not a universal assumption, if we agree that Thomas Jefferson was not a Christian, where do you believe he got his idea of which rights are inevitable and inalienable?
Look, I don't know if Jefferson was a Christian or not, and one of the things that in politics and life I try to be reluctant to judge the faith of others and reluctant to judge anyone's path to salvation. I think that's a question for God and not for me to decide. Most historians describe Jefferson as a deist rather than a Christian. He clearly believed in a God, whether it was the Christian God of the Gospels, one can debate that. Look, the content of natural rights is a topic that has been debated for millennia. And one can certainly have vigorous disagreements about the exact contours, but I will say there are elements of them that are relatively universal, and I actually think life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is a pretty good capstone encapsulation. Now, the traditional iteration of the natural rights of man, if you look back, say, to John Locke, were life, liberty, and property. And Jefferson omitted property and substituted in the pursuit of happiness, really in an effort to elide over slavery. And that was the principal reason not to have the word property there. And look, slavery, I think, is this nation's original sin. There are obvious inconsistencies in Jefferson's being a slave owner while penning the words, all men are created equal. That is a fairly enormous tension. But I think at the end of the day, for me, I'm a Christian, so the Bible provides guidance and direction for me on what natural rights consist of, but I also think that government can debate where those lines should be drawn. But if you look at, so I'll give an example in terms of the ubiquity of the Judeo-Christian tradition for understanding what our rights are. One of the cases that I litigated when I was the Solicitor General of Texas was the Texas Ten Commandments case. So if you guys go to the state capitol, on the north side of the state capitol, there is a monument to the Ten Commandments.
Van Orden v. Perry?
Huh?
Van Orden v. Perry.
Yes, Van Orden versus Perry is the case. Impressive.
It's a recent topic here at UATX that we've had a student lecture on.
Oh, good, good. Well, the monument itself, you can go see it. I don't know if any of y'all have seen it. It's on the northern side. It's 6 foot 3 inches tall, 3 foot 6 inches wide. It is red granite. And it was donated to the state in 1961. And it was challenged by an individual plaintiff, an atheist named Thomas Van Orden, who was actually a homeless man, who walked by, he saw the monument, he was offended by the monument, he filed a lawsuit saying the Constitution prohibits displaying the Ten Commandments on public lands. That case went all the way up to the Supreme Court. I argued it in the Court of Appeals, won in the Court of Appeals. When it was at the Supreme Court, I'll ask you a trivia question that my guess is no one will know, which is perfectly understandable. How many times does the image of the Ten Commandments appear in the courtroom of the U.S. Supreme Court? Now, no one will know that answer. The answer is 43. So when you're in the courtroom, it appears twice on the doors leaving the courtroom. On the lower panels, there are 2 images of the Ten Commandments on the bottom carved in the wood. It appears 40 times on the brass gates that are going along the side on both sides of the court. And then it appears once over the left shoulders of the justices. There's a frieze of great lawmakers. And among them are Moses holding the Ten Commandments written in Hebrew. You can read the Hebrew. He is looking down on the justices. And there's a reason the Ten Commandments appear 43 times in the courtroom, because the Ten Commandments were foundational in the rise of Western law, the common law, and American law. So there is no doubt that one can disagree on natural rights, but there is a ubiquity, that's the phrase the Supreme Court has used, in the Judeo-Christian teachings in the rise of American law.
Thank you.
As you said, the Declaration of Independence from the King of England was a treasonous act that the founders carried through with political treasonous violence. Yeah. When would you take up arms against the government? When do you think we have an obligation to become a traitor?
So you're really trying to get me in trouble. Look.
You haven't had the privilege of having one of the challenging UATX questions
Yeah,
yet, so.
Look, that is a difficult question. I'll answer it a couple of ways. The Declaration itself describes that when a government becomes so repressive that the people have an obligation to take up arms and overthrow it. I don't think we are there, particularly as long as there is a means through the democratic system to change it. My answer on this is sort of related to, if you run for office in Texas, you used to get with some frequency, and you still get sometimes, a question, should Texas secede from the Union and become our own nation? And my answer to that question was always the following, which is, I understand where you're coming from. I understand the frustration. You look at policies of the national government that don't reflect your values, that don't reflect the values of Texas, and Texas would be an amazing nation. We were our own nation for 9 years, and we could take the military bases, we could take oil and gas, we could take NASA, and we'd be just really fine. That being said, my answer to that question is, look, maybe someday, but I think Texas has an obligation to help save America. I think America is a venture worth saving, and I think Texas is in a unique role that without Texas, America would be in a much worse situation. So I'm not ready to give up on America, and I'd say the same thing. You can go to an easy example of, if you're living in Nazi Germany, you've reached the point at which it is justified. If you are living under communist oppression.
What would that be? How would I know if I'm under Nazi Germany?
Well, you would see concentration camps, you'd see people being murdered in mass, you'd see grotesque human rights violations. A wonderful book, if you haven't read it, is Bonhoeffer. It is a fabulous book talking about, and sadly, the Christian church in Germany ended up being complicit in the horrors that were carried out, as far too many leaders in the church were complacent. By the way, a similar idea, if you look at Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail, there's a great tradition every year when that letter was written. A number of senators go to the floor of the Senate and read it out loud, and it's a bipartisan tradition. I've done it several years. As powerful as the letter from a Birmingham jail is, to read the words out loud gives a different power and weight to them. And a point that I love to emphasize is, does anyone here know to whom Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail was addressed? It was addressed to the clergy of America. Because people often forget that Dr. King was also Reverend King. He was a pastor, and he was telling pastors, you are sitting on the sidelines, and racial discrimination is wrong. And there's a wonderful passage, my favorite passage in the letter, is when Dr. King talks about the church should be a thermostat and not a thermometer. In other words, we should not just reflect whatever the temperature, whatever the view is outside, but we should change it. And so, look, under Nazi Germany, violent revolution is absolutely justified, and I think even morally compelled. When you have a system of unfair and oppressive laws, I think Dr. King's peaceful, nonviolent civil rights movement is one of the most effective movements mankind has seen. I think Mahatma Gandhi's peaceful, nonviolent movement in India was incredibly effective. I will tell you on the question of violent revolution, when Tiananmen Square happened, Tiananmen Square, massive protest, and there was a political ad that the NRA, the National Rifle Association, ran. They bought full-page newspaper ads in 6 papers nationwide. I think the Washington Post, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Chicago Tribune, USA Today, and LA Times. Full-page ad just with a picture of Tiananmen Square. And the words on the ad said, this week, 1 million people rose up in protest in communist China. Imagine what would have happened if they had had guns. And that is a newspaper ad from 30 years ago that I still remember because it made a powerful argument of, you know what? If the citizenry were armed, that's not a protest that is put down, that's a revolution. So that is ultimately the critical check, and it goes back to where I started about sovereignty beginning from we the people. We are ultimately the check, but I do think the threshold for revolution is quite high, particularly as long as there is an alternative avenue to fight for change. I think the right moral decision is to use every peaceful and nonviolent avenue unless it becomes so oppressive that there is no alternative but revolution.
Thank you very much, Senator. Thank you for that wonderful masterclass on the Constitution that all of our students can take into their classes now. I only have one contention from the faculty. I know you implored them to go and seek out the communist professors. Unfortunately, we don't have any. I don't know what happened. They didn't apply.
You know, I will say there are some down the street.